2. The actual registering of Hamasuke went smoothly enough, but they got caught up for an hour and a half. The part that took the longest was the sketch, the time it took to draw Hamasuke. It would have been faster if they'd done it with magic, but Ainz would have had to cover the fee, so he passed. Of course, he didn't want to seem tight-fisted, so he was forced to come up with a random excuse. "It's too late now, but I'm interested in drawing was kind of forced, huh? Well, whatever. So now we head to Inferior's," he said to Narbril in front of the guild after the registration was taken care of. Then he went over to Hamasuke. He was already used to it, or rather, the merry-go-round was not a ride for only the affluent, lovers and families. What was wrong with solitary older dudes getting on? Ainz no longer cared what anybody thought. Making full use of his high physical ability, with movements as graceful as a celebrated gymnast, he sprang onto the wise king of the forest. He had neither saddle nor harness, but his few hours of experience had turned him into a fine equestrian. The passers-by who witnessed the spectacle oohed and awed. Some women even squealed. The looks from adventurers were particularly intense, and incredulous once they'd checked the plate hanging around his neck. "I'm the one who can't believe it! What happened to your concept of aesthetics?" He grumbled in his head and was about to give the order to depart when a voice called out to stop him. "Say, aren't you the one who went to gather herbs with my grandson?" He turned toward the elderly-sounding voice and found an old woman standing in the road. "Who are you?" He already had a guess. If what she said was true, then there was only one person she could be. "My name is Lizzie Belair. I'm Inferia's grandmother." "Oh, so it is you. As you say, I escorted Inferia to Kugane. I'm Momon, and this is Nabe." Nabe bowed, and Lizzie smiled at her. "What a beauty! I can hardly believe my eyes. And what is this magical beast you're riding?" "This is the wise king of the forest, Hamasuke." "I'm Hamasuke, I am. Very pleased to meet you." "What? This mighty beast is the wise king of the forest?" Lizzie's shout caused all the eavesdropping adventurers to look even more surprised and voice their shock among themselves. "Is that really the legendary magical beast?" "She is. We ran into her on the way to gather herbs. I forced her to surrender." "Wow, the wise king of the forest." She was seeing stars. "So, where is my grandson now?"
"Ah, he took the herbs and went home a little while ago. We're actually on our way to your place to pick up our reward."
The old woman was visibly relieved to hear as much. Then, with a strange look in her eye, she said, "Oh, I see. Why don't we go together, then? I'm very interested in hearing about your adventure." Her offer was music to Ainz's ears. "Gladly." Lizzie guided the group through the streets of Arantel. "Okay, let's go in." They'd arrived at the shop, and Lizzie had taken the key out in front of the door when she cocked her head. She pushed, and the door opened silently without any resistance. "That boy! So careless," she grumbled as she entered, and Ainz and Narbril followed. "Inferia! Hey, Momon's here!" She shouted toward the back, but a deep quiet reigned over the shop. There was no sign anyone was there. Where could he be? Ainz gave a short answer to the puzzled query.
"Well, this is trouble."
Ignoring the uncomprehending Lizzie, he placed his hands on the hilts of his great swords. Narbril knew immediately what he meant and removed the sheaths. "What is it?"
"Just follow me."
With that curt reply, he fully drew his swords, gripped them properly, and strode toward the back of the shop. He threw open the door and turned right down the hallway. He was in a stranger's house, but there was no hesitation in his footsteps. When he came to the door at the end of the hallway, it took a moment for Lizzie to catch up. Then he asked her,
"What's behind this door?"
It's where we store the herbs. And the back door is there too." She didn't know what had happened, but she could tell something was wrong. Ainz ignored her and opened the door. The smell that assaulted their noses was not medicinal herbs, but something more foul. The stench of blood. Peter and Lecruit were near the door, Dinah further away, and all the way in the back was Ninya. All four were slumped against a wall, legs splayed, arms flopped limply at their sides, and all across the floor was a puddle of dark blood, enough that it looked like every drop in their bodies had been bled out. What in the... Lizzie tottered toward the threshold in shock, but Ainz held her back by her shoulders and entered swiftly ahead of her. All of a sudden, Peter began to make a jerky attempt to stand, but more quickly than he could, with not a split second of indecision, a greatsword sliced through the air. Peter's head landed with a thump and rolled across the floor. Then, as Lecruit was trying to get up, the sword returned in one fluid motion to slice off his head as well. Lizzie could hardly believe the horrors occurring before her eyes while Dane managed to get upright. The face he turned to them was not the face of a living thing. From its bloodless pallor, clouded eyes stared down. There was a hole in his forehead, and one glance was enough to tell it had been fatal. There was only one reason the dead would walk. They'd been turned into undead. "Zombies!" Lizzie screamed, and Dinah lurched toward them with a hostile groan. Ainz hastily stabbed with his greatsword, and the huge blade went through Dinah's neck. His destabilized head wobbled loosely as he sank to the floor. No one moved anymore. In the silence, Ainz looked at Ninya in the back, who didn't so much as twitch. "Inferior!" It finally dawned on Lizzie what had happened, and she ran off to look for her grandson. Ainz glanced at her briefly before turning to Narbril with an order.
"Guard her. My passive skill, Immortal Blessing, doesn't detect anything, so we can assume there aren't any more undead around. But there may be some enemies hidden somewhere."
"Understood." Narbril gave a quick nod and ran after Lizzie. After seeing that both of them were gone, Ainz turned his attention back to Ninya. He slowly knelt down before him and patted him down lightly. Satisfied there was no corpse booby trap like he used to use when PKing in Yggdrasil, he raised Ninya's head. Needless to say, he wasn't unconscious, but dead, probably beaten to death with a blunt object. His face was swollen up, and in such rough shape that the word pomegranate was perhaps the most apt metaphor. If Ainz hadn't known it was Ninya, it would have been difficult to tell who it was. His left eye had been crushed, and its vitreous humor had run down his cheek like tears. Every bone in each of his fingers had been smashed. The skin had split, revealing bright red flesh underneath. In some places, even the flesh was mangled. When Ainz loosened the youth's clothes and looked underneath, his eyes widened. He put them back the way they were and cleared his throat.
"I see. All over, then."
His body had been beaten into a state just as gruesome as his face. Internal bleeding had discolored his skin, and it was hard to find anywhere that wasn't damaged. Ainz silently closed Ninya's eyes. No one heard him whisper,
"It's just a little unpleasant."
"My grandson! Inferior isn't here!" Lizzie returned, practically screaming. Ainz, who had just finished gathering all the bodies into one corner of the room, answered her calmly.
"I went through their things, and there's no evidence that someone was looking for anything in particular. That must mean their aim from the start was to kidnap Inferior."
"Ah!"
"Take a look at this."
Ainz pointed to some writing scrawled in blood on the wall behind where Ninya had been. If he hadn't moved the body, they probably wouldn't have found it.
The sewers? Does that mean they've taken him into the sewers?
The people behind this atrocity could be trying to mislead us. We shouldn't rule that out. And I don't know how big the city's sewer system is, but I think it would take quite a while to search it. What do we do about that?
Look, there are numbers written before the words 28. That must mean something.
That's even more suspicious. It's not clear what those numbers stand for, but one idea would be that they divided up the entire city into a square grid of 8 or more boxes to a side, and those numbers indicate an intersection. Or it might indicate some sort of address. But would Ninya even have had the energy to think that far? Even if Ninya wrote it, do you think the culprits would really let that much information slip? It seems altogether too convenient.
Even more wrinkles appeared on Lizzie's wrinkled face. She seemed just about ready to explode in anger at how awfully cool-headed Ainz was. Then her eyes moved to the corner where all the 4 bodies were laid out.
Who are these people?
Adventurers who undertook your grandson's request along with me. We had parted ways. They were supposed to be unloading the herbs.
What? Then these are your friends?
Where another adventurer might have nodded, Ainz shook his head.
No, we just happened to be traveling together.
Lizzie blanched at his cold reply.
More importantly, faced with their corpses, I've been thinking about a lot of things. But what do you make of the fact that they were turned into zombies?
Create undead. That means they have someone who can use at least tier 3 magic, right? What else could it mean?
Here's what I think. You should take care of this as soon as possible.
That's a given. But what do you mean?
These guys could have manipulated them with mind control, or they could have hidden the bodies. There were other options, but instead of taking them, they set up this little game. Maybe they didn't care if they were found out. Or were they just that confident that they could get away? It has to be one of those. If they were going to go to the trouble of making zombies, they could have taken them with them.
If their aim was strictly to kidnap Inferior, they could have gained plenty of time just by concealing the corpses. The fact that they didn't do that meant that they either had some secondary aim, or they wanted to force Lizzie to do something. The latter was a simple matter, but the former would mean that Inferior's life and powers had value to them. And probably, whatever they wanted could be completed in a short amount of time. Would these brutal killers send him home safely when they were done? Lizzie's face, as she understood what Ainz was getting at, went past pale to white as a sheet. To figure out where in this huge city they'd gone, and then begin searching from there, it would take way too long. The only clue they had was the sewers, but Momon was voicing doubts. This time, slipping through their fingers was the waning light of Inferia's life. Ainz made a quiet suggestion.
How about making a request?
His icy voice continued.
This is definitely the sort of thing you should hire an adventurer to take on.
A light in Lizzie's eyes seemed to indicate that she had grasped his meaning.
You're in luck, Lizzie Belair. Standing before you is the best adventurer in town. I'm the only one who can bring back your grandson. If you make a request, I might even take it on. But it'll cost you. I can tell what a tricky job this is going to be.
But yes, you could. You had that potion. And you must be strong if the wise king of the forest obeys you. I'll do it. I'll hire you.
I see. And you're prepared to compensate me?
How much will it take?
Everything.
What?
I'll take everything you have.
Lizzie's eyes grew wide and she shuddered.
Everything you have. If Inferior comes home safely, give me everything.
You
Lizzie murmured, backing away as if she were frightened.
don't mean money or potions by this everything of yours, do you? They say a demon can grant a wish in exchange for your soul. You're not demons, are you?
Even if we were, does it matter? You want to save your grandson, don't you?
Lizzie said nothing, just nodded once, biting her lip.
Then there's only one answer, right?
Yeah, I'll hire you. I'll give you everything I have. Save my grandson.
Okay, the deal is sealed then. To get right down to business, do you have a map of the city? If you do, I want to borrow it.
She seemed dubious, but went to get him a map right away.
Okay, now we're going to find out where Inferior is.
You can do that?
This time, I can. Either our enemies are idiots, or...
As his sentence trailed off, he looked at the four bodies.
Well, we're going to get things underway in here, so go look in the other rooms and see if you can find anything that might lead us to Inferior's kidnappers. Things will get hairy if this was just a diversion. Anyhow, this is your house, so you know it best.
Having made up some reason to get rid of Lizzie, Ainz watched her go and then turned to Narbrul.
What are you going to do?
It's simple. Look, their plates are gone. It was probably the kidnappers who took them. The question is, why would they take those items when they didn't take any of the more valuable items? What do you think?
My apologies. I don't know.
There.
Lord Ainz?
A slightly shrill voice sounded in his head, and some kind of squeaking noise layered over it like a second audio track.
Entema?
Yes, sir.
Entema Vasilisa Zeta was, like Narbrul, one of the Pleiades.
There's something I need to talk to you about.
I'm busy right now. I'll contact you when I get some time.
Understood. Then, please contact Mr. Salbedo when you have the time.
The spell vanished, and Ainz continued his conversation with Narbrul, who was looking at him curiously.
Trophies. They're hunting trophies. The criminals must have taken them as mementos. But that was a fatal mistake. Narbrul, use this.
He reached into an infinity haversack and pulled out a scroll.
It's locate object. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what we're looking for.
Understood.
The moment she unrolled the scroll and was about to cast the spell, Ainz grabbed her hand. She was caught by surprise.
You fool,
he declared icily. His level tone made her shoulders jump.
My apologies.
When you're using intelligence-gathering magic, preparing adequately to guard against your enemy's potential counterspells before casting is an iron rule. Considering your opponent could be using Detect Locate, protecting yourself with fake cover, and Counter Detect is the most basic of the basics. Then you have...
Ainz prepared 10 scrolls. He went on to explain the rest of them to Narbrul as if he were lecturing at a university. When collecting intelligence using magic, it was necessary to take elaborate defensive measures. That was fundamental. When Ainzul Gon was going to PK someone, they first collected any information they could get about the player and then sneak attacked to win in one fell swoop. That was their basic strategy. No fuss PKing, developed by the guild member Squishy Mo, who declared, "The battle is over before it begins!" That was why Ainz was teaching Narberl now, so that in the future, when they encountered players, she would be able to fight with an advantage.
And that's it. Really, it's also basic to use skills for boosts and counters as well, but we probably don't need to go that far against these guys. If they had casters able to do anything stronger than this, they wouldn't have cast such low-level spells on these corpses. Okay, Narberl, do it.
Finally free to act, Narberl unfurled each scroll in order, naming each spell as she went. The scrolls burst into heatless flames and burnt up in a matter of seconds to release the magic sealed inside. Once she had used them all and was protected by numerous defensive spells, she cast Locate Object. Then she pointed at the map. "They're here." Ainz couldn't read what was written there, so he searched his memory to remember what was in that area.
The graveyard. So there's a good chance it's not the sewers.
The graveyard in Arantel was in a league of hugeness all its own, partially because the city was used as a military base. The magic was pointing to the location farthest in.
Okay, then next use clairvoyance. Cast Crystal Monitor at the same time, and show me what's going on over there too.
Narberl used the two scrolls, and they saw countless human figures on the screen that appeared in the air. But something was strange about the way they were moving. Many of them were jerking awkwardly. There were also countless figures that were definitely not human. And in the center of it all was a boy. He was dressed differently, but there was still no mistaking him.
Got him. And the plates are in this area. An undead mob, huh?
The place was occupied by a huge swarm of undead. They were all lower tier, but there were lots of them. "What will you do? Should we teleport in to attack all at once? Or take them by storm from the air with fly?"
Yeah, sure, we can wrap it up on the down low. Don't be stupid.
Narberl looked confused, so he explained.
They have this huge mob of undead, so they must be trying to do something big. If we can put a stop to that while saving Inferior, it'll be great for our reputation. If we deal with this in secret, all we're likely to get is the reward from Lizzie.
Of course, if they didn't deal with it as soon as possible, Inferior could be killed. Even Ainz couldn't summon and control that many undead at once, so there had to be some trick to it. Maybe it's somehow dependent on Inferior's life? But if that were the case, then he wanted to know that trick, even if it meant sacrificing Inferior. Ainz was most concerned with strengthening the Great Tomb of Nazarick. If letting Inferior die would benefit Nazarick, he would choose that.
Well, we can't gather much more intelligence as we are, and it would take too long anyways.
Ainz murmured as he proceeded to the door. Flinging it open, he shouted,
"Lizzie, we're done, and we're going to the graveyard."
"What about the sewers?"
she screamed from somewhere, and they could hear her footsteps rushing over.
They were just misleading us. Their real aim was the graveyard. And as a bonus, there's an undead army numbering easily in the thousands.
"What?"
He'd just taken a guess. It wasn't like he was going to count them all.
Don't be so surprised. We're going to break through. The problem is what happens if the undead overflow the graveyard. Please tell as many people about this as possible. That we need people to stop them as they start escaping. It's not a very convincing story, but you're famous here, so people will listen to you, right? If the undead overflow the graveyard and no one is ready for them, there'll be trouble.
Ainz frowned under his helmet. He needed people to make a fuss. The bigger the fuss, the better his reputation would get at the end. Telling her to spread the word was a strategic move.
That's enough chit-chat. Time is running out, so we're leaving.
"Do you have a way to break through the undead army?"
Ainz looked calmly at Lizzie and pointed at the greatswords on his back.
It's right here. Isn't it?